Under Seattle's fiery red sunset, Sophie Bennett, a 17-year-old in a faded green hoodie, steps into King County Courthouse, facing mocking stares to fight for justice. Her journey is not just a tale of courage, but a flame igniting hope. If you're watching and love inspiring stories like this, share where you're tuning in from, hit like, subscribe, and follow for more stories delivered daily. Today, join us to witness the next turning point in Sophie's battle. The courtroom at King County Courthouse in Seattle was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the creak of the leather chair as Judge Robert Callahan leaned back, a smug smile curling his lips. His piercing gaze swept across the room, settling on Sophie Bennett, a 17-year-old girl standing alone at the defendant's table. Her disheveled brown hair was hastily tied into a low bun, and her faded green hoodie and worn sneakers squeaked softly on the polished wooden floor as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. In her hands, she clutched a thick stack of papers, meticulously handwritten notes that felt as heavy as the scornful stares bearing down on her. "Miss Bennett," Judge Callahan's voice rang out, each word dripping with arrogance. "Do you realize where you are? This is a courtroom, not a high school debate club." Snickers rippled from the lawyers seated behind their tables, their amused glances darting back and forth. Sophie felt her cheeks flush, but her eyes, bright and resolute, never wavered from the judge. In her chest, her heart pounded, not from fear, but from a fire blazing within, a fire of determination she had kindled during long nights poring over her brother Ethan Bennett's law books. Ethan, once her guiding light, was now in prison for a crime he didn't commit. His books, gathering dust in their small Capitol Hill apartment, had become Sophie's teachers. She had read them page by page, under the dim glow of a desk lamp, silent tears falling as she thought her brother, who always believed she could achieve greatness. "Sophie," he had said, his smile as warm as Seattle's rare sunlight, "you're smarter than anyone I've ever met. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words echoed in her mind now, drowning out the mocking laughter. "Your Honor," Sophie spoke, her voice clear despite the thundering of her heart. "I know exactly where I am, and if you allow me, I'll prove I belong here." The courtroom fell silent, the crowd holding its breath. A 17-year-old daring to address the judge like that? Judge Callahan raised an eyebrow, his smug smile twisting into a frown. "Oh, is that so?" he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Well then, Miss Bennett, enlighten us all." Sophie took a deep breath, her small hands tightening around the stack of papers. She wasn't just fighting for her client, but for herself, to prove she wasn't a fragile girl, that she could stand against the world. And as she began to speak, her voice rose like a declaration, plunging the courtroom into stunned silence. The entire courtroom at King County Courthouse in Seattle seemed to hold its breath as Sophie Bennett began to speak. Her voice, though youthful, carried a confidence that silenced the earlier jeers. She set the stack of papers on the table, her small hands no longer trembling, and looked directly at Judge Robert Callahan. "Your Honor," she said, "I am here to represent Mr. David Larson, who has been wrongfully accused of embezzlement. I will demonstrate that the evidence against him is insufficient and lacks legal grounding." The crowd murmured, and the lawyers behind the oak tables exchanged skeptical glances, but Sophie stood unwavering. In her mind, an image of her brother Ethan Bennett surfaced, his eyes alight whenever he spoke of justice, the nights he sat at their Capitol Hill kitchen table, explaining legal statutes to her as if they were fairy tales. "Miss Bennett," Judge Callahan interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade, "what do you think you can accomplish that a real lawyer couldn't? This isn't a place for children to play at law." Laughter erupted again from the rows behind, but Sophie felt a surge of anger flare in her chest. She was no child. She had spent hundreds of hours in her small apartment, under the dim glow of a lamp, memorizing every statute, every legal precedent from Ethan's books. Each page was a reminder of her brother, the brother unjustly imprisoned 50 miles from Seattle for a crime she knew he didn't commit. "Your Honor," Sophie replied, her voice steadier, stronger, "I'm not here to play games. I'm here because Mr. Larson deserves a fair chance, and I'm prepared to ensure he gets it." She opened a sheet of paper, her fingers tracing the handwritten lines. Under Section 4 of the Washington State Penal Code, an embezzlement charge requires clear evidence of intent to misappropriate funds. I have documents showing that the alleged transactions involving Mr. Larson were, in fact, accounting errors, not criminal acts. She cited a 2018 case, 547 U.S. 813, with such precision that a seasoned lawyer in the back paused mid-scribble and looked up. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Callahan, his smug demeanor now gone, leaned forward, his brows knitted tightly. The lawyers, who had once mocked her, now scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across paper. Sophie felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of her neck, but she didn't falter. She pressed on, her arguments as sharp as a knife, each word slicing through the wall of doubt surrounding her. Your Honor, if the court permits, I will present further evidence showing that Mr. Larson was framed by individuals with personal motives. Her eyes flashed, not just with determination, but with a deep hidden pain, the pain of a girl who had seen justice twisted and was now determined to set it right. As Sophie Bennett concluded her razor-sharp argument in the courtroom at King County Courthouse in Seattle, her gaze briefly lingered on David Larson, her client. The 50-year-old man sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly, looking at her with a flicker of fragile hope. But within Sophie, another fire burned, not just for Larson, but for Ethan Bennett, her brother, unjustly imprisoned 50 miles from Seattle. She took a deep breath, suppressing a wave of emotion as an image of Ethan, with his radiant smile from better days, surfaced in her mind. He had once been her hero, but now the name Richard Dalton, the man who had falsely accused Ethan of assault, pierced her heart like a thorn. Miss Bennett, Judge Robert Callahan spoke, his voice now stripped of its earlier sarcasm, replaced by a hint of curiosity. You mentioned personal motives. What evidence do you have for such a serious claim? Sophie gave a slight smile, a blend of confidence and mischief, as if she were playing a chess game and had just spotted the winning move. Your Honor, she replied, I have documents showing that the alleged transactions tied to Mr. Larson coincide with a time when a powerful figure in the company deliberately falsified financial records. I request permission to present them. The crowd murmured, and a lawyer in the back muttered, Who does this kid think she is? Perry Mason? Snickers followed, but Sophie didn't care. She liked the idea of being a modern version of the legendary TV lawyer. Only she wore a hoodie instead of a suit and held handwritten notes instead of a cigar. Sophie opened a file, her voice ringing clear as a bell. According to the 2023 financial reports, the irregular expenditures recorded under Mr. Larson's name all bore the approval signature of a senior executive, someone I believe is connected to Richard Dalton. Dalton's name dropped like a small bomb, causing the lawyers to stop writing and look up. Sophie knew this name was more than just a name. It was the thread tying Larson's case to her own pain. 2 years ago, at the Rusty Anchor Bar in Tacoma, Dalton, a wealthy businessman, had accused Ethan of assaulting him after an argument. The evidence was flimsy, but Dalton's influence had secured Ethan's conviction, robbing him of his dream of becoming a lawyer. Sophie's throat tightened as she recalled her last visit to Ethan, 3 months ago, through the thick glass of the prison visitation room. Don't give up, Soph, he had said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Find the truth, not just for me, but for others like me. Those words now burned like a torch guiding her path. She looked at Judge Callahan, her eyes blazing. Your Honor, I'm not just here to defend Mr. Larson. I'm here to ensure justice isn't twisted by men like Richard Dalton. That was the truth. She wasn't only defending David Larson, her 50-year-old client, but aiming her spear at a monster power. Richard Dalton, the 45-year-old businessman who manipulated evidence to imprison her brother, Ethan Bennett, and was now trying to destroy Larson. Dalton was the embodiment of corruption, with his tailored suits worth thousands and a fake smile masking a cold heart. The courtroom fell silent, and in that moment, Sophie felt the weight of her mission, a 17-year-old girl challenging an entire system. Miss Bennett, Judge Robert Callahan spoke, his voice now tinged with caution. That's a serious accusation. What evidence do you have linking Mr. Dalton to this case? Sophie smiled, a sharp, cunning smile, as if she had just turned the chessboard in her favor. Your Honor, I have it, she said, pulling a thick stack of documents from her pile. This is an internal report from Mr. Larson's company, showing that the alleged transactions were approved through an account linked to a shell company owned by Richard Dalton. The crowd buzzed, and one lawyer whispered, "This kid's putting on a Hollywood show." Sophie winked to herself in her mind. If this were a movie, she'd definitely be the star, and Dalton would soon be cast as a villain unmasked. She continued, her voice as sharp as a razor. "This shell company, Your Honor, transferred $250,000 to an offshore account just 48 hours after Mr. Larson was accused. I have the transaction receipts to prove it." She held up a sheet of paper, her gaze sweeping the courtroom like a director staging a climactic scene. But just as she was about to continue, the courtroom doors burst open and a small cry rang out. Mia Torres, Sophie's 17-year-old best friend, rushed in, her face flushed from running 2 miles from Capitol Hill. "Sophie," Mia shouted, holding up a tiny USB drive. "I found this in your mailbox. Someone left it there this morning." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Callahan slammed his gavel, roaring, "Order!" Sophie, her heart pounding, took the USB from Mia. "What is it?" she whispered. Mia, panting, replied, "I don't know, but there was a note saying the truth about Dalton." A jolt of electricity shot down Sophie's spine. This could be the silver bullet to take down Dalton, or a trap. She turned to the judge, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "Your Honor, I request permission to review the contents of this USB. If it pertains to Richard Dalton, it could shed light on Mr. Larson's case and other injustices." Callahan frowned, but a spark of curiosity flickered in his eyes. "Very well," he said, "but tread carefully, Miss Bennett. Don't turn this courtroom into a circus." Sophie nodded, but in her heart, she knew. The show had only just begun, and Richard Dalton was about to face the spotlight. The courtroom doors at King County Courthouse in Seattle still trembled from Mia Torres' dramatic entrance with the mysterious USB drive. Sophie Bennett, her heart pounding, gripped the tiny device in her hand, feeling as though she held an unpinned grenade. The crowd in the courtroom held its breath, their eyes fixed on the 17-year-old girl standing at the defendant's table, her faded green hoodie now like a suit of armor. Judge Robert Callahan, his face hardened, motioned for a court clerk to bring a laptop. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice low like a warning, "if this is a stunt, you'll pay dearly." Sophie nodded, but in her mind, she pictured herself as a noir detective, about to unveil Seattle's greatest secret. The clerk plugged the USB into the laptop, and a grainy black and white video flickered onto the large screen behind the judge. The crowd murmured as images of the rusty Anchor Bar in Tacoma, 30 miles from Seattle, appeared. But before the video could play, the courtroom door swung open again, and a man strode in, his steps hurried, his disheveled suit looking as though he'd just run a marathon. "Your Honor," he called, his voice hoarse. "I'm Thomas Reed, a former employee of Richard Dalton. That footage, I'm the one who sent it." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sophie spun around, eyes wide. Thomas Reed, 42, with a weathered face, looked like a supporting character in an action movie, stepping in at the perfect moment to deliver the knockout blow. "Order!" Judge Callahan slammed his gavel, but even he couldn't hide his curiosity. "Mr. Reed, explain yourself." Thomas, panting, stepped forward. "Your Honor, that footage is from a night of the incident at the Rusty Anchor 2 years ago. Richard Dalton paid to have it suppressed, but I kept a copy." Sophie felt her heart skip a beat. This was the evidence she had dreamed of, the key to clearing Ethan Bennett, her brother, falsely accused by Dalton of assault. The video began to play. The blurry but unmistakable footage showed Ethan, 25, entering the bar, exchanging words with Dalton, then turning to leave. Dalton, with a malicious smirk, stood, grabbed Ethan's arm, and shoved him hard. Ethan tried to de-escalate, but Dalton threw the first punch. The courtroom crowd gasped as it became clear Dalton was the aggressor, not Ethan. Sophie felt tears well up, but she clenched her fists, maintaining her steely facade. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but strong, "this footage proves my brother, Ethan Bennett, acted in self-defense. Richard Dalton lied to destroy him, and I believe he's also behind the false accusations against Mr. David Larson." The lawyers, who had once mocked Sophie, now sat in silence, their pens still. Judge Callahan looked from Thomas to Sophie, his eyes weighing the world. "Mr. Reed," he said, "are you aware of the consequences of this?" Thomas nodded. "I am, Your Honor, but I can't live with the lies anymore." Sophie looked at Thomas, gratitude mingling with resolve. Richard Dalton, the giant of corruption, had just been dealt a crushing blow, and she, a 17-year-old from Capitol Hill, was the one wielding the bat. The storm in the courtroom at King County Courthouse in Seattle had barely subsided after the security footage shook Richard Dalton's credibility. Sophie Bennett, 17, stood firm at the defendant's table, her eyes blazing like the lamp in her small Capitol Hill apartment. The footage had just proven that Ethan Bennett, her brother, acted in self-defense against Dalton, but Sophie sensed this was only the tip of a submerged iceberg. Thomas Reed, Dalton's 42-year-old former employee, still stood there, his weathered face like something out of a thriller. Judge Robert Callahan, now looking as though he was struggling to maintain composure, ordered, "Mr. Reed, take your seat. Miss Bennett, proceed." Before taking his seat, Thomas Reed stepped close to Sophie and whispered something in her ear. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling as though she were stepping into the final act of a Hollywood action movie, where she was the unexpected heroine. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "this footage doesn't just clear my brother. It reveals a larger network, where Richard Dalton is merely a pawn." The crowd buzzed, and one lawyer muttered, "This kid's watched too many spy movies." Sophie suppressed a smile. If this were a movie, she'd definitely have a killer one-liner right now. She held up a new set of documents, pulled from the USB that Thomas Reed had sent to her home and that her best friend Mia Torres had delivered. These are transaction records from Dalton's shell company, showing a $500,000 transfer to an account linked to a high-ranking Seattle official just before Mr. David Larson's case was filed. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sophie pressed on, her voice like a relentless drumbeat. "I have evidence of similar payments to a Tacoma police officer, 30 miles away, who conveniently overlooked the security footage from the rusty anchor. This isn't just Dalton's doing. This is a web of corruption, stretching from corporate offices in Denver to the halls of power in Washington, D.C. She paused, letting her words sink into crowd, feeling as though she were landing a knockout punch in a televised boxing match. Judge Callahan furrowed his brow, his fingers tapping lightly on the bench. "Miss Bennett, you're accusing an entire system. Do you realize the gravity of this?" Sophie nodded, but in her heart, she saw Ethan, imprisoned 50 miles from Seattle, and David Larson, who nearly lost everything. "Your Honor, I do. But if we don't expose the truth, people like Mr. Larson, like my brother, will keep paying the price." She glanced at Thomas Reed, who gave a subtle nod as if to say, "Keep going, kid." The crowd fell silent, their eyes glued to Sophie. She knew she had just ignited a spark for a much larger explosion, and Richard Dalton, wherever he was in the city, was surely feeling the heat. But Sophie wasn't afraid. She was ready to turn this drama into a performance of the ages, where justice would be the brightest star on the stage. The dim lights of the courtroom at King County Courthouse in Seattle lingered in Sophie Bennett's mind as she stepped outside, the fiery red sunset staining the sky. Her accusations about Richard Dalton's corrupt network had just left her lips, but instead of triumph, a chilling premonition clung to her. Sophie, 17, knew she had poked a hornet's nest, a system steeped in power, with Dalton merely a puppet for bigger players. She gripped her backpack tightly, hurrying toward her Capitol Hill apartment a mile away, her mind filled with images of her brother, Ethan Bennett, still imprisoned 50 miles from Seattle. That night, as Sophie pushed open the door to her small apartment, her heart seemed to stop. The room had been ransacked. Ethan's law books lay scattered across the floor, furniture upturned, her laptop gone. On the kitchen table, a note was pinned with a paring knife, its scrawled message reading, "Stop or you'll regret it." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face, but then a surge of anger flared within her. "Trying to scare me," she muttered, imagining herself as the lead in a Tarantino-style action flick, ready to kick back. She snapped photos of the scene and called Mia Torres, her 17-year-old best friend, shouting into the phone, "Mia, my apartment's been broken into. There's a threat. But the real climax came moments later. As Sophie checked the windows, a sharp sound pierced the air from the balcony. The shattering of glass. She whipped around, heart pounding, and saw a dark figure slip through the broken glass door, a glinting object in their hand. Without thinking, Sophie grabbed Ethan's old baseball bat from under the bed, shouting, "Get out now or I'll swing." The figure, clearly startled by the fierce pint-sized girl, stumbled over a pile of books and bolted out the front door, leaving behind a dropped employee ID card on the floor. Sophie, panting, picked it up. It bore the name of a consulting firm in Denver, matching Dalton's shell company. "Amateurs," she muttered, feeling like a detective in a movie who just narrowly escaped danger. The police arrived 20 minutes later, documenting the scene and taking the note as evidence. "You should stay somewhere else for a few days," an officer advised, but Sophie shook her head. "I'm not running," she said, her voice resolute. She called Mia, arranging to stay temporarily at her friend's place in Capitol Hill, but deep down, she knew she couldn't stop. Images of David Larson, her 50-year-old client who nearly lost everything, and Ethan, the brother who believed she could change the world, urged her on. "Dalton and his goons think I'll scare," she told me over the phone, her voice brimming with defiance. "But they don't know who I am yet." In the darkness of her violated apartment, Sophie clutched the employee ID, ready for the next battle, where she would turn this threat into a weapon against those trying to silence her. After the break-in at her Capitol Hill apartment, Sophie Bennett, 17, took refuge at Mia Torres's house, bringing the employee ID from the Denver consulting firm, the latest clue against Richard Dalton. Sitting on Mia's couch, Sophie gripped a card, her anger still simmering after the "stop or you'll regret it" threat. But instead of fear, she felt like the lead in a spy thriller, ready to deliver the decisive blow. "They think they can scare me," she told Mia, her voice defiant. "But I'll make them regret starting this." Mia, 17, raised an eyebrow. "You're like a teenage superhero, but what's the plan with that card?" Sophie knew she needed a bigger ally. She thought of Emily Harper, a 32-year-old investigative journalist, known for articles that shook American politics. From the Seattle Public Library, 2 miles from Capitol Hill, Sophie sent an encrypted email to Emily, attaching a photo of the ID and a summary of Dalton's corrupt network. Just 3 hours later, Emily replied, "Meet me at the Bean Haven, Portland, 8 p.m. Sophie, thrilled as if invited to star in a blockbuster, immediately contacted Thomas Reed, Dalton's 42-year-old former employee who had provided the security footage to the court. That night, at the Bean Haven Cafe, 170 miles from Seattle, Sophie and Thomas sat across from Emily with her leather jacket and laptop. Emily looked like a rock star of journalism. "All right, you two," she said, her voice sharp. "Show me your treasure." Sophie handed over the USB containing the rusty anchor footage from Tacoma and documents from Dalton's company, including the $500,000 transfer to a Seattle official. Thomas added, his voice trembling, "I also have internal emails proving Dalton paid off Tacoma police to hide evidence." Emily scanned the files, her eyes lighting up like a director discovering a golden script. "This is dynamite," she said. "If we break this, the whole country will be buzzing." In the next 48 hours, Emily worked relentlessly, verifying every detail with the speed of a NASCAR driver. Sophie and Thomas, holed up at Mia's, followed Emily's updates like fans awaiting a movie trailer. By 7 a.m. Tuesday, Emily's article detonated across every platform, its headline screaming, "Seattle's Corruption Network. Famed businessman exposed." The piece laid bare Dalton, the Denver consulting firm, and ties to politicians and police. Twitter exploded, with hashtag Seattle Scandal soaring to the top trends. Sophie, watching the news on Mia's phone, burst out laughing. "It's like the whole country's watching a TV drama, and we're the writers." But the joy lasted less than a day. Emily called, her voice taut with urgency. "Sophie, the Department of Justice just launched an investigation, but Dalton's vanished from Seattle. He's on the run, and someone helped him." Sophie gripped the phone. Images of Ethan imprisoned 50 miles away, and David Larson, her 50-year-old client, flashing through her mind. "He won't get away," she said, her voice hard as steel. With Emily and public outrage behind her, Sophie knew the battle had escalated to a new level, a nationwide game of cat and mouse, and she was ready to be the star of the chase. The media storm sparked by Emily Harper's article still raged across Seattle as Sophie Bennett, 17, prepared for the final fight. The expose of Richard Dalton's corrupt network had prompted the Department of Justice to open an investigation, but news of Dalton's escape refused to let Sophie rest. She left Mia Torres's house in Capitol Hill, 2 miles from King County Courthouse, to prepare for her brother Ethan Bennett's appeal hearing. In her heart, she carried a hard-earned lesson. Justice doesn't come on its own. It must be seized step by step with persistence and courage. While Sophie focused on clearing Ethan's name, Richard Dalton believed he had slipped through the law's grasp. He fled to an isolated mansion in the Portland suburbs, 170 miles from Seattle, hiding under a false identity. With money stashed from his shady dealings, Dalton thought he could start anew, far from the spotlight of justice. But he underestimated the resolve of people like Sophie and Emily Harper, as well as the investigative network Harper's article had ignited. The day of Ethan's appeal hearing arrived, the courtroom bathed in sunlight streaming through high windows. Sophie sat in the front row, her faded green hoodie replaced by a blazer borrowed from Mia, her hands clasped tightly to contain her emotions. She wasn't representing Ethan. That role belonged to a seasoned attorney Emily had recommended, but it was Sophie who had provided the pivotal evidence. The security footage from the Rusty Anchor in Tacoma, 30 miles from Seattle, and documents from Dalton's Denver Shell Company. As the attorney spoke, his voice echoed, "Your Honor, this footage proves Ethan Bennett acted in self-defense against Richard Dalton. Payment of $500,000 to a Seattle official reveal efforts to conceal the truth." Sophie looked at Ethan, 25, standing beside the attorney, his face gaunt after 2 years in prison 50 miles from Seattle. She remembered the lesson he taught her as a child. "Soph, the truth is always stronger than lies, but you have to be brave enough to find it." Those words now lit her path like a torch. As the attorney concluded, Judge Robert Callahan, who had once mocked Sophie, surveyed the courtroom. "Based on the new evidence," he declared, his voice low but clear, "Ethan Bennett's conviction is overturned. He is to be released immediately." The courtroom erupted in applause. Sophie leapt to her feet, tears streaming down her face, and rushed to envelop Ethan in a tight embrace. "You did it, Soph," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You really did it." Sophie smiled through her tears, feeling as though she'd just run a 26-mile marathon. "We did it, Ethan," she corrected. The crowd surrounded them, cheers ringing out, but Sophie knew this victory was more than freeing her brother. It was proof that a 17-year-old from Capitol Hill could challenge an entire system. As they left the courthouse, Sophie held Ethan's hand, the Seattle sunlight glowing like a promise. She thought of David Larson, her 50-year-old client who had been exonerated, and the greatest lesson she'd learned. Justice demands sacrifice, but every small step is worth it. "What's next for you?" Ethan asked, his smile as radiant as it had been in the old days. Sophie looked at him, her heart brimming with resolve. "Study law the right way," she said, "and keep fighting for people like you." And in the moment the siblings stepped out of the courthouse with radiant smiles, a new headline shook the newsstands. Richard Dalton had been arrested at a private airfield in Nevada, 15 miles from Las Vegas. He was caught attempting to board a flight to South America, carrying a suitcase stuffed with cash and forged documents. Thanks to a tip from a former Dalton employee who had worked with Sophie, the FBI had tracked him down. Documents seized from his Portland mansion revealed further evidence of Dalton's evidence tampering and bribery, strengthening the case against him. 3 weeks after the courtroom victory, the gentle autumn sunlight filtered through the window of the small law office Sophie had rented. She sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of Ethan's old law books, their pages steeped in the scent of aged paper and ink, a smell that, to Sophie, carried the promise of hope and new beginnings. She had just secured Ethan's exoneration, overturning the unjust conviction that had imprisoned him. Now, with her brother free, Sophie knew her journey was only beginning. She opened a letter from the University of Washington, announcing her acceptance with a full scholarship. A mix of joy and nervous excitement made her heart race. But as her gaze fell on the framed photo on her desk, a snapshot of her and Ethan beaming outside the courthouse on the day of his release, she recalled the relentless months of struggle. She had once been a 17-year-old mocked in the courtroom, dismissed as an amateur by Judge Robert Callahan himself. Yet her persistence, belief in justice, and love for her brother had transformed her into a true warrior. Dalton's trial took place on a cloudy morning at Seattle's federal courthouse. Sophie, now a freshman law student at the University of Washington, sat in the public gallery, her gaze icy as she watched Dalton. Gone was the arrogance he once exuded. In its place was a haggard man in handcuffs, facing a litany of charges from financial fraud to obstruction of justice. When the judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, the courtroom erupted in quiet applause. Sophie squeezed Mia's hand, feeling a wave of relief mixed with pride. Justice, though delayed, had finally held the guilty accountable. Dalton bowed his head, his figure fading behind bars, a testament that no one could evade the truth forever. Beneath the radiant June sunlight, Seattle sparkled like a gem along Puget Sound. Skyscrapers reflected glinting light, and the air carried the aroma of freshly roasted coffee and blooming flowers from market stalls. Years after her resounding courtroom triumph, that scene remained vivid in Sophie Bennett's mind, but she had changed. Now, 22, Sophie entered King County Courthouse with the confidence of a true attorney. In a sleek black suit, her curly hair neatly tied back, she was no longer the 17-year-old once ridiculed. Her eyes were sharp, her voice steady, carrying the strength of her years at the University of Washington Law School and an unwavering resolve. The vibrant city outside seemed to fuel her, ready to fight for justice as she had from the very beginning. Today, she represented Maria Alvarez, a single mother wrongfully accused of theft. As Sophie stepped into the courtroom, no mocking laughter followed. Instead, opposing counsel's eyes held caution, even respect. Judge Callahan, now retired, was gone, but Sophie felt the echo of past challenges as she began her opening statement. "Your Honor, my client deserves exoneration, and I will prove it with the truth." As she presented her case, each word cut like a blade, her legal citations delivered with precision, and the courtroom fell into a respectful silence. Sophie wasn't just fighting for Alvarez, but for people like Ethan, those abandoned by the system. Every argument she made was a reminder that justice wasn't just an ideal, but a battle requiring courage and perseverance. When the trial concluded with a not guilty verdict for Alvarez, Sophie stepped out courthouse, sunlight bathing her face. She paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the profound lesson her journey had taught her. Justice doesn't come on its own. It's won by those who dare to stand, even when the world turns its back. With a radiant smile, Sophie walked forward, ready for the battles ahead, carrying the flame of justice Ethan had ignited within her.